I didn't spend 3 hours doing my makeup just to have dinner with some unemployed guy raising 2 kids. Don't ever call me again, you pathetic gold digger.
Take him outside.
Eat before it gets cold. I'll pay for this meal.
That night, the arrogant manager and the spoiled rich girl were unaware that the man they had just scorned was the chairman of a powerful corporation. Click subscribe now if you are ready to see the best punishment for people who use money to look down on people. Let us now go back to the beginning of this brutal test. Nathan Sterling remained seated in the VIP section of the Oak, the front of his worn collar shirt soaked with water. The glass Jessica had slammed down was still tilted near the edge of the tablecloth, water running in a thin line past the appetizer plate no one had touched. The nearby tables didn't stare directly for too long, but they looked long enough to remember the image of a man left behind after the worst date in the restaurant that night. Jessica had been gone for almost a minute, but her expensive perfume still hung around the table like an insult that refused to leave. She had arrived 20 minutes late, ordered the most expensive dish, asked Nathan what he did for work, and then changed her whole face the second he said he was unemployed and raising 2 young children. She didn't know the old jacket he was wearing had been bought at a thrift store for $12 just to complete the role. She also didn't know the man in front of her was the founder of Sterling Hospitality, the company that owned the very restaurant she had just walked out of. Nathan didn't chase after her. He only sat still, his right hand lightly turning the old wedding band on his ring finger. 4 years after his wife's death, that habit still returned whenever he had to make a cold decision. The recent blind dates had all felt the same. Smiles grew wider when women heard the Sterling family name. Voices softened when they found out he owned hotel shares, and eyes slid past photos of Oliver and Sophie, as if the 2 children were fine print in a luxury deal. That was why Nathan had started this experiment. Hid his identity, hid his money, hid his car, hid every single thing women had ever wanted from him, just to see if anyone could still see a father beneath the poor man's shirt. Greg Marlowe, the manager of the Oak, walked over to the table after the surrounding guests had been given enough time to whisper. He wore a fitted black suit, slick-back hair, and the kind of professional smile reserved for platinum credit cards. For Nathan, that smile didn't appear. Greg looked at the frayed shirt, the old leather shoes, and the table that was ruining the elegance of the VIP section. He didn't ask if Nathan was okay. He looked at the bill. His voice dropped low but stayed sharp as a blade. He told Nathan to pay immediately, or leave the area, because what had just happened was affecting the restaurant's image. Nathan looked up. He had heard hundreds of managers talk about customer experience, service culture, and brand standards. But coming out of Greg's mouth, all of it became one simpler sentence. Poor people aren't allowed to draw attention in a place where rich people are having dinner. Nathan touched the pocket of his jacket. In the old wallet he had prepared for the role, there was only one $20 bill, some loose change, and a cheap debit card under a fake name. He could end the whole thing with one phone call, have Greg suspended in 10 minutes, and walk out to the Maybach waiting in the alley. But he didn't. If the test stopped with Jessica, he would only learn that one more woman was shallow. What he needed to know went deeper. How did his own restaurant treat a person believed to be poor when no one knew who he was? Greg bent down, picked up the bill, and placed it closer to Nathan's hand than necessary. He reminded him that the VIP area had its own standards and that security could assist if a guest refused to cooperate. An older couple at the next table paused with their forks and knives, then lowered their heads and kept eating, as if politeness meant pretending not to see. Nathan still hadn't said anything when Elena Morales stepped forward. She didn't move quickly because she still had a tray in her hand with 2 glasses of white wine for another table. The Oak's server uniform fit her well, but the cuffs had started to fade. Her black shoes were worn down at the heels, the kind of wear that came from double shifts. She placed the 2 glasses of wine at the correct table, apologized softly, then turned back toward Greg and Nathan. Elena said this table was hers. Her voice wasn't loud or confrontational, but it was enough to cut across Greg's hand as he signaled for security. Greg looked at her like he was looking at a small mistake in procedure. He reminded her that the VIP section needed to be handled quickly, and she had no authority to turn a troublesome guest into her personal responsibility. Elena only bent down to pick up the wet napkin from the chair, her voice still even, and said she would clear the table and handle the bill according to procedure. If she needed assistance, she would call him. Greg didn't like being addressed by a server in a voice that calm. He looked at her for a few more seconds, then turned away with the expression of a man who would remember this for a later shift. Nathan looked at Elena. She didn't ask why he had been left there. Didn't ask about Jessica. Didn't pity him with her eyes. She only handed him a dry napkin so he could wipe his shirt himself. Elena cleaned up the broken glass with a small pair of tongs, not her bare hand. She placed each piece into a paper towel and checked under the table to make sure no shards had fallen into the walkway. When she changed the small tablecloth and picked up the cracked glass, her eyes paused briefly on the roasted chicken dish in front of Jessica's seat. The chicken was almost untouched. The skin was still golden and glossy, the roasted potatoes sitting beside asparagus. That dish at the Oak cost as much as a careful family's groceries for a whole day. Jessica had ordered it because she wanted to try it, take a picture, then leave it behind after 3 bites of appetizer and an insult. Nathan looked at the chicken longer than he meant to, not because he was hungry, because in his head he saw Oliver trying to act like he didn't care when Sophie asked why other families had big roast dinners on Sundays, while theirs usually had soup and bread during the days Nathan played poor. Elena saw that look. She didn't ask right away. She kept clearing the table, giving Nathan time to hold on to whatever dignity he had left. Only after everything was clean did she lean in slightly and ask if he wanted to take the untouched food home. Nathan acted as if even that small request was hard to say. He looked down at the tablecloth, then admitted that his kids at home rarely got to eat roasted chicken like that. Elena paused for less than a beat. She nodded and said she would pack it up. No poor thing, no pitying look. Just a normal, clean agreement, as if a father wanting to bring food home to his children was nothing he needed to apologize for. She carried the chicken into the side kitchen area. Nathan sat there, listening to dishes clink beyond the swinging door. Greg was standing near the bar, talking with a regular customer in a blue suit. Now and then, he glanced toward Nathan, annoyed that the guest who didn't fit the image still hadn't disappeared. Nathan turned the wedding band one more time. At the side kitchen door, Elena opened a paper takeout box and carefully arranged the chicken, potatoes, and vegetables inside. She didn't dump everything in like leftovers. She placed napkins on top, added 2 plastic forks, then stopped in front of the dessert counter. Inside the glass case was one untouched strawberry tart. Nathan could see through the gap in the door when another employee passed by. Elena said something to the young cashier behind the counter. He shook his head and pointed at the inventory slip. Desserts couldn't just be given away. Elena stood still for 1 second, then reached into the pocket of her apron. She pulled out a $5 bill, folded in half and smoothed it with her thumb. That wasn't spare money. Servers didn't keep their last tip in an apron pocket unless they needed it. She handed the bill to the cashier. He hesitated, then rang it up. Nathan saw everything. His throat went dry, even though the water in front of him was still more than half full, and his shirt was cold and wet. He had signed deals to buy entire restaurant chains with numbers so long lawyers had to check them 3 times. But Elena's $5 made it impossible for him to look away. It didn't come from an account with extras. It came from a long shift, from shoes worn down at the heels, and from a mother who might also be counting bus fare, milk money, and tuition. Kindness from someone who has plenty can feel light. Kindness from someone short on everything carries a weight that makes the person receiving it lower his head. Elena came back with the takeout box tied with paper string. On top was a smaller box holding the slice of strawberry tart. When he looked up, she said the chef had made extra, and he should take it home because children always needed a little something sweet. The lie was told so softly it barely felt like a sin. Nathan didn't expose it. If he said he had seen her pay, he would take the dignity out of the gift. Oh, he only placed his hand on the paper box and thanked her. Elena accepted the thanks with a small nod, but as she turned away, Greg called her toward the bar. Nathan didn't hear all of it. He only saw Greg lean in and speak quickly, his eyes flicking toward the takeout box on the table. Elena stood straight, both hands holding her order pad in front of her stomach. When she came back to pick up the bill, her face looked normal, but her jaw was a little tight. Greg had just reminded her that the Oak wasn't a charity kitchen. Nathan knew it from the slower way she walked. The remaining bill wasn't large after Jessica's card had already covered the drink deposit, but under Nathan's role, it was enough to end the night. He opened his wallet and placed the last $20 bill on the tray. Elena looked at the bill, then looked at him. Maybe she understood that this was everything the man in front of her wanted anyone else to see. She didn't offer to lower it, didn't say she would handle it. She processed the bill, brought back a few coins, and placed them beside the takeout box so he wouldn't have to hold out his hand for change in front of too many eyes. Nathan put the coins into his pocket. Haas stood, his shirt still damp, the chicken box and tart box in his hands. A few guests watched him. Greg stood at a distance, one corner of his mouth lifted as if the thing damaging the VIP section's image was finally leaving. Elena paused, wiping another table, but when Nathan passed, she quietly shifted a chair that was blocking the walkway so his paper bag wouldn't catch on it. A small movement. No one noticed. Nathan did. He stepped out of the oak through the front door and into the cold city wind. The glass behind him reflected the image of a poor man humiliated by a date, carrying a box of leftovers for his children. He walked to the corner, then turned into the dark alley behind the restaurant. A black Maybach waited under the shadow of a brick wall, and his private driver immediately opened the rear door. Nathan got in and placed the food box on the seat beside him as if it were fragile. In the dim light of the car, he opened the tart box. The strawberry slices were still perfectly in place, deep red and carefully arranged. He thought of 8-year-old Oliver and 5-year-old Sophie, two children who had lost their mother too early and had to live with a father who no longer knew whom to trust when someone tried to enter their lives in the name of love. Jessica had looked at those children as an imaginary burden. Elena, who didn't even know whether they were real, had bought them a slice of cake with her last tip. Nathan wiped his fingers on a napkin and took a small satellite phone from the car compartment. Traffic outside kept moving past the oak, and no one knew that inside the Maybach parked in the alley sat the chairman of the entire restaurant empire. Huck called the group's chief human resources officer. When the person on the other end answered, his voice wasn't loud, but the driver in the front seat immediately fixed his eyes on the windshield. Nathan ordered every appointment on his calendar for the month to be canceled. By tomorrow morning, HR needed to create a fake employee file for him. The new name would be Nate Miller. Position applied for, dishwasher and kitchen assistant at the Oak. The other end went quiet long enough for Nathan to hear the air conditioning inside the car. Then the director asked whether there was an emergency at the restaurant. Nathan looked through the dark window and saw Greg standing in the lobby, smiling at a wealthy couple, while Elena bent down to pick up a fallen napkin near a child's table. He didn't answer directly. He turned the old wedding band one final time. "There's someone in there I need to understand better," he said. "And there's something inside my own restaurant that's been rotting for too long without anyone reporting the smell." The next morning, Nathan Sterling disappeared from his own schedule. Inside Sterling Hospitality's internal system, investor meetings, a site review for a new hotel chain, and lunch with the advisory board were all moved with one short note. Chairman handling special operations review. No one below the top level knew where that review was happening. Only the group's chief human resources officer and one legal advisor were ordered to create a temporary file for a man named Nate Miller, 38 years old, single father, applying for shift work as a dishwasher and kitchen assistant. Nathan drove himself to the Oak in an old daily rental sedan, with no driver, no expensive watch, and no suit jacket. He wore a gray t-shirt, faded jeans, and slip-resistant shoes he had bought in a hurry at a discount store. The wedding band was still on his finger, but it was no longer the only thing that made him look like a man with a past. The employee entrance of the Oak opened into a narrow hallway behind the kitchen. The smell of old frying oil, floor cleaner, and onions clung to the brick walls. Nathan had walked through the back-of-house areas of many restaurants in their group, but usually with a regional director beside him, a chef who had been warned ahead of time, and shelves that had been wiped cleaner than usual. That morning, no one knew who he was, so the Oak appeared the way it lived every day. Greg Marlowe stood inside the small office beside the storage area, holding Nate Miller's file between two fingers like it was a piece of trash. He looked over Nathan's clothes, stopped at the cheap shoes, then asked only a few questions. Dishwashing experience? Could he work nights? Any problem taking lower probationary pay until he proved himself? Nathan answered briefly. He said he needed the job. When Greg heard that, he decided it was enough. He shoved a wet apron that smelled like soap into Nathan's hands, pointed toward the dish station, and said if he were slow, he shouldn't bother coming back tomorrow. The wage written on the probation paperwork was so low, Nathan knew Central HR would never approve it if the real file had been submitted. But Greg didn't submit it. Ran the oak through a gray zone of trial workers, off-the-book shifts, and people who needed money too badly to ask why. The dish station behind the kitchen was full to the rim. Porcelain plates, streaked with sauce, wine glasses with lipstick marks, heavy cast-iron pans, baking trays that still smelled of burnt butter. The industrial dishwasher roared like a small engine. Steam hit Nathan's face and made his t-shirt stick to his back in less than 10 minutes. He had built a restaurant empire by understanding every detail of operations, but it had been a long time since he had stood in the lowest position of that chain, where every mistake in the dining room eventually turned into a pile of dishes someone had to scrub clean. Elena walked into the kitchen close to 11, her hair tied neatly, her order pad tucked under one arm. When she saw him wearing a dishwasher's apron, both hands buried in soapy water, she stopped for a moment. Surprise moved through her eyes, then caution. She didn't ask why the man who had been humiliated the night before was standing there. At the bottom level, plenty of people disappeared from elegant dining rooms and showed up at back doors for reasons of their own. Elena only set a tray of glasses near the sink and warned him to watch the cracked glass on the top row because it could cut his hand. Greg didn't let that small kindness pass. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, criticized Elena for being slow with her tables, criticized Nathan for splashing water onto the floor, then ordered both of them to wipe down the service area again before the lunch rush. Nathan recognized a dangerous kind of management. You didn't have to hit anyone, didn't have to yell all day. You only had to make people feel like they were always in debt for being allowed to stay. By noon, the restaurant was full. Greg shifted from kitchen bully into polished host in the dining room. He bowed his head to a couple wearing gold watches, smiled at a group of lawyers, personally pulled out a chair for a woman he called an important regular. But when Elena walked past a few seconds slower because a table with children had spilled water, Greg pulled her into the blind corner near the bar and reminded her that her tips tonight would be adjusted if customers complained. The word adjusted was spoken smoothly, as if it were policy and not a threat. Nathan saw the tip split at the end of the shift. The official system showed that employees received all electronic tips minus processing fees, but Greg held back 30% under what he called the Operational Support Fund. Towels, broken glasses, employee meals, training costs. New employees looked at each other. Older employees lowered their eyes. Elena took her envelope, opened it, counted quickly, then folded it again right away. She didn't react, but her thumb pressed against the edge of the envelope longer than necessary. In the walk-in, Nathan saw worse. A crate of softening vegetables had been relabeled. A tray of chicken had its use-by date covered with white tape. The sous chef shook his head when he saw Nathan looking, then signaled for him not to ask. When Greg stepped in, he said the product was still usable if cooked thoroughly and served under a heavy sauce. That was a sentence Nathan had never wanted to hear in any restaurant carrying sterling standards. He wiped his hands on his apron and memorized the crate location, the supplier code, and the name of the shift lead. That afternoon, a wine glass broke at table 6. The guest had broken it, because Nathan saw the man's elbow catch the stem while he was laughing loudly. But Greg stepped over before Elena could clear it and announced that she would have to pay for it. The price he named was 5 times higher than the actual unit cost, Nathan knew. Elena knelt down and picked up the shards with tongs, her face unchanged. When she stood, Greg wrote the penalty in his little notebook. She only asked if it could be deducted after her tuition payment. Greg laughed and said her bills weren't the restaurant's problem. Nathan stood beside the dish station, gripping a plastic tray so hard his knuckles went white. He wanted to step forward, throw his real identity onto the table like a knife, but if he did it right away, he would only deal with Greg. He wouldn't see the whole disease, and he still didn't understand how Elena lived under that weight and still kept her voice soft when she warned someone else about a cracked glass. The employee lunch break came close to 3, when the restaurant had thinned out. The break room was really just a damp corner of storage, with 2 plastic chairs, a folding table, and a small refrigerator humming in the corner. Nathan sat down, both hands burning from hot water and chemicals. Elena came in after him, took a cheap sandwich wrapped in foil from a paper bag, broke it in half, and pushed one half toward him without asking if he needed it. Nathan accepted it, because the night before she had taught him that refusing a small gift could sometimes hurt the giver more. The sandwich had only egg, wilted lettuce, and a little mayonnaise. Elena ate slowly, eyes on the clock, because the break lasted only 12 minutes if Greg didn't call for help. She didn't complain about the withheld tips, didn't complain about the glass she had to pay for. People who are used to having small pieces taken from their day don't always retell every cut. They only learn how to keep working with less blood. Nate asked why she still stayed there. Elena wiped crumbs from her fingers before opening her wallet. There wasn't much money inside, only a bus pass, an insurance card, a few folded bills, and a small photo. The boy in the picture looked about 7, brown hair, eyes turned slightly away from the camera, holding a green plastic dinosaur. Elena placed one finger on the edge of the photo as if she were afraid it would get dirty. That was Toby. He had mild autism, needed a specialized learning environment, needed teachers who knew how to speak slowly, needed a fixed routine so small changes wouldn't overwhelm him. Tuition didn't wait for his mother's pride to recover. She said that last sentence plainly, the way someone talks about the weather. Pride doesn't pay bills. Nathan clenched his jaw. He thought of Oliver and Sophie, of private tutors, child therapists, well-paid nannies, and the way he still felt alone in fatherhood. Elena didn't have those layers of padding. She stood directly between her child and every bill. From that moment on, Nathan no longer saw her only as the woman who had bought the strawberry tart. Elena wasn't kind in some sweet, easy-to-consume way. She had the endurance of someone whose life had forced her to bend down many times, but who still refused to use her own hands to push someone else down. She didn't need anyone to give her a title. Over the next few days, Nate Miller became an invisible part of the kitchen. He washed dishes, took out trash, mopped floors, stacked boxes, and chopped vegetables when they were short-staffed. Greg gave him the dirtiest jobs because he thought Nate would quit after 2 shifts. Nathan didn't quit. He remembered. He saw timesheets changed after employees went home, saw Greg make kitchen assistants sign that they had received employee meals so the cost could be deducted from their wages, even when the meal was only leftover soup. Saw Elena swap shifts with a young server whose mother had been hospitalized, then get punished by Greg for changing shifts without permission. Every night when Nathan went home, he showered for her for a long time before hugging Oliver and Sophie. Sophie demanded to smell him. Oliver frowned because 8-year-olds can tell when adults are hiding something. Nathan didn't explain. He turned his wedding band after the children fell asleep, thinking about how he had once believed the greatest danger to his family was people who wanted to enter it for money. Now he saw another danger. People like Greg inside his own system using the Sterling logo to keep poor employees quiet. On Friday afternoon, the Oak prepared for its busiest night of the week. Rain began to fall outside, and customers with reservations kept calling to confirm. Elena had just started her shift when her phone buzzed. Nathan was carrying a crate of clean glasses toward the front, so he saw her face change the second she answered. Toby's school had flooded because of a burst pipe, and students had to be picked up early. Elena looked at the reservation board, looked at Greg scolding a bartender, then stepped into a corner and made 3 calls in a row. No one answered. Her usual sitter had already taken another shift. After the penalty for the wine glass, she didn't have enough money in her wallet to call emergency childcare. An hour later, Toby appeared at the back door in a blue raincoat, holding his plastic dinosaur. Elena brought him in through the delivery entrance, knelt down to wipe the water from his hair, and spoke slowly so he would understand that it was only for a few hours and they would go home after she finished work. She led Toby into the driest storage room in the back, where there were a few empty cardboard boxes, and the air conditioning sounded quieter than it did in the kitchen. Nathan saw but said nothing. He brought in a few markers left from the labeling box and tore off a clean piece of cardboard for the boy to draw on. Toby didn't look directly at Nathan, but he sat beside the boxes and began drawing repeated circles. Nathan sat a short distance away, close enough to watch over him, far enough that he wouldn't feel pressured. He asked about the dinosaur in a low voice. Toby didn't answer right away and then said a very long species name Nathan didn't catch. The boy corrected his pronunciation with a serious expression. Outside the kitchen, Greg's voice rose at someone, then faded away. Elena checked through the crack in the door every few minutes, lips pressed tight with worry. Nathan signaled that everything was okay. He had faced furious investors, media crises, and board meetings after midnight. But sitting on a cardboard box beside a child trying to stay calm in a restaurant storage room, he understood that the weight of being a parent didn't need a boardroom to become heavy. Close to 6, Toby drew a crooked strawberry tart on the cardboard. Nathan recognized the shape and felt his throat tighten. The boy said his mother had once told him children needed a little something sweet. That small sentence pulled the first night back into the room, the $5 bill, the tart box, Elena's gentle lie. Then the storage room door was kicked open against the wall. The impact made Toby jump. Both his hands flew to cover his ears. The marker rolled off his lap. Greg stood in the doorway, his face dark under the fluorescent light. His eyes moved from Toby to the drawing on the cardboard, then to Nathan sitting beside the boxes. Elena ran up behind Greg, her serving tray still in her hand. She hadn't had time to say anything. Greg was already looking at her with the cruel satisfaction of a man who had finally found a mistake big enough to erase every plea she could make. And in the damp storage room behind the oak, Nathan understood that his test had gone too far to still be called a test. The storage room door slammed against the wall hard enough to make the cardboard boxes shake. Toby jerked away from the cardboard he was drawing on, both hands instantly clamping over his ears. The red marker rolled across the tile floor, leaving a curved streak in front of Greg Marlowe's polished shoe. Elena rushed up behind him, her serving tray still hanging from her wrist, her face going white when she saw her son caught in the corner of the storage room. Greg didn't ask if the child was okay. He looked at Toby like he was a health code violation, then looked at Elena with the satisfied cruelty of someone who had finally found an excuse big enough to crush an employee who had annoyed him for too long. In the small world Greg ruled over, power didn't have to be large. It only had to be large enough to decide who got the evening shift, who kept their tips, and who had to lower their head in front of everyone else. Toby curled in behind the boxes, his eyes not landing on anyone, both hands pressing so hard over his ears that his fingertips turned red. The dishwasher outside, the laughter from the dining room, and Greg's voice all poured into the narrow room at once. For a child who needed steady routines, steady lighting, and steady voices, that moment felt like the whole restaurant was collapsing on top of him. Elena set the tray down so fast that a spoon slipped off and hit the floor. She moved past Nathan and dropped to her knees in front of Greg, raising both hands, not to beg for herself, but to keep him from stepping any closer to Toby. Her explanation came out broken. The school had flooded. No one could pick him up. She only needed to keep him in the storage room for a few hours until her shift ended. She promised Toby wouldn't go outside, wouldn't touch food, wouldn't bother guests. Every sentence got smaller than the one before it, because the more she spoke, the more she understood Greg wasn't listening to show mercy. He was listening to choose where to hit. Greg stepped past her. He grabbed Toby by the wrist and pulled him up. Toby didn't understand what was happening. He only twisted slightly, then panicked harder when a stranger's hand touched him. Lathan immediately moved one step forward, but Elena snapped her head toward him, her eyes begging him not to make everything explode in front of her son. Toby made a high, choked sound. Not exactly a cry, more like breath caught in his throat. Elena crawled toward him, wrapped her arms around his shoulders, and tried to place her own body between Greg and the child. Greg let go of Toby, but not because he had softened. I only wanted the whole kitchen to see. He pulled the storage room door open wider, letting the kitchen light fall straight on Elena kneeling on the floor. A few employees turned their heads. The sous chef froze beside the prep table. Two servers carrying trays glanced at each other, then looked down. People who had lived long enough under Greg's authority knew that some scenes became more dangerous the more closely you watched them. He ordered Elena to stand up, but she only held Toby closer. The boy shook his head over and over, his mouth repeating something unclear, his hands still over his ears. Nathan crouched a short distance from Toby and kept his voice low and even, telling him to look at the dinosaur on his raincoat. Toby didn't look at him, but the sound in his throat eased a little. That irritated Greg even more, because even inside the chaos he had created, Nate, a new dishwasher, was the one making the child less afraid. Greg turned on Elena and shifted the attack from Toby to the thing he knew would hurt her more, her bag. He snatched the brown cloth bag from the hook near the storage room and threw it onto the kitchen floor. The zipper burst open. Everything spilled out. An old wallet, a bus pass, a small medicine box, tissues, Toby's tuition bill folded into quarters, and a few coins rolling under the stainless steel shelf. A photo of Toby landed face down near a puddle of water. Elena let go of Toby just long to reach for the photo before it got wet. She didn't grab the wallet first, didn't grab the money first. She grabbed the picture of her son. That one movement tightened something in Nathan's chest in a way he hadn't prepared for. Losing his wife 4 years ago had taught him many kinds of pain, but the pain of watching a mother choose between money, work, and her child's safety in front of strangers still made it hard for him to breathe. Greg announced that Elena was fired immediately. He said bringing a child into an operations area was a serious violation, damaged the image of a fine dining restaurant, threatened sanitation, and put VIP guests at risk. Then he used the ugliest phrase of the night, calling Toby a filthy little germ that didn't belong anywhere near a place like the Oak. Elena lowered her head fast, not out of obedience, but because Toby was looking at her. She was afraid her son would read on her face that the world had just called him something like that. She pulled him to her chest, placed one hand behind his neck, and whispered a string of steady sentences she had probably used many times when Toby was overwhelmed. "You're okay. Mommy's here. Look at my hand. Breathe slowly." Greg didn't stop. He took the shift book from the kitchen counter and calculated in a dry voice that Elena's entire 2 weeks of wages and unpaid tips would be withheld to cover the policy violation, the disruption, and the cost of finding last-minute staff. No official form appeared, no HR representative, no written record. Just the voice of a middle manager standing in the middle of a kitchen, turning one mother's rent money into punishment in front of her son. Elena finally let go of Toby to pick up her things. She knelt on the floor, collecting each coin that had rolled under the shelf. Toby sat down beside her, hands still over his ears, his shoulders shaking with small broken sobs. He didn't understand what 2 weeks of wage meant, but he understood that his mother was gathering things someone else had thrown onto the floor. Mathan watched Elena's hands tremble as she picked up the bus pass, then looked at Greg standing over her, his shadow stretching across the kitchen floor like a long stain. When you see a mother on her knees, picking up every last coin from the floor while her autistic child is curled up in fear, something inside your chest tightens at the cruelty of people who abuse power. If you believe quiet workers like Elena deserve respect and a miracle of their own, take 1 second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support gives us the strength to keep believing in justice. Now watch how this rotten manager pays the price after crossing the billionaire's final line. Nathan took the wet apron off his neck. The movement was small, but several kitchen employees turned toward him. For 2 weeks they had gotten used to seeing Nate hunched over the dish station, quietly taking Greg's orders. Now he laid the apron on the edge of a box, not rushed and not so angry he lost control. He stepped forward and stood between Greg and Elena. His gray t-shirt was wet with dishwater, his hands still red from chemicals, but his spine was straight in a way that didn't belong to someone used to being bullied. He reminded Greg that withholding an employee's entire paycheck and tips over an undocumented internal violation could run into federal labor law. He didn't say much. Just enough for the kitchen to hear the phrases, "Tips belong to employees, wages can't be seized at will, and a frightened child is not a reason to humiliate his mother." Greg stared at him for a few seconds, then laughed. The sound burst out too loudly for the quiet kitchen. He called Nathan a ragged dishwasher trying to lecture management about the law. He stepped forward and shoved his shoulder hard into Nathan's chest. Nathan moved back half a step so he wouldn't knock into Elena behind him, but he didn't fall. That made Greg even angrier. He said one phone call would bring the police to drag both of them out for causing a disturbance, trespassing in an operations area, and bringing a child into a dangerous workplace. The word police made Elena's head snap up. Not because she was afraid for herself first. She looked at Toby. For an overwhelmed child, police sirens, strangers, flashing lights, and rapid questions could turn an already terrible night into a memory that never healed. She held her son tighter, her lips pressed so hard they went pale. Nathan saw all of it. He saw Toby bury his face into his mother's shirt, and saw Elena cover one of his ears with one hand while the other still held her open wallet. He remembered Oliver at his mother's funeral, remembered Sophie not understanding why someone could go to sleep and never wake up. Fatherhood teaches a person that some lines aren't about your own pride. They're about the safety of a child. Greg had crossed that line. In the pocket of his faded jeans, the small folding satellite phone sat like a piece of another life. Nathan had carried it since the first day. In case a real emergency happened, he had thought an emergency might be financial evidence, food poisoning, or a legal situation that couldn't wait. He hadn't expected it to be a 7-year-old boy covering his ears and crying in the storage room of his own restaurant. Greg was still talking. He said Elena should be grateful he wasn't calling Child Protective Services. He said Nate should go back to the dish station before he lost his probation pay too. He said this restaurant had standards, and people like them always dragged those standards down. Each sentence laid another thick layer of silence over the kitchen. A young server turned her face away and wiped the corner of her eye with the back of her hand. The sous chef set down his knife but didn't step forward. Fear has a very specific shape. Good people standing close together without enough money to all lose their jobs. Nathan reached into his pocket. Greg saw the movement, and his smile twisted. He thought Nate was pulling out some old phone to record him or call someone who didn't matter. He was about to make another sarcastic comment, but Nathan had already opened the phone. The small screen lit up. He pressed an internal number that didn't exist in any employee directory at the Oak. When the line connected, Nathan's voice changed. It didn't get louder. It didn't turn performatively cold. It simply returned to its proper place. The voice of someone used to giving orders and having the system respond at once. He said one sentence. Lock down every system at the Oak. Get legal down here in 5 minutes. The kitchen went so quiet that the dishwasher behind them could be heard through each cycle of water. Greg looked at Nathan, then at the phone, then let out a scoffing laugh. He said Nate was insane and asked what legal team, what system, and whether the dishwasher thought he was the chairman of the corporation. Nathan closed the phone and slipped it back into his pocket. He didn't answer. He only looked down at Toby and lowered his voice, reminding the boy to keep his hands over his ears if the sound got too loud. Elena looked at Nathan then with a completely different expression. Not gratitude, not trust. The confusion of a person who had just realized the man standing beside her might have hidden far more than she thought. Out in the dining room, a payment terminal stopped accepting cards. The reservation screen at the host's stand switched into administrator lock mode. In Greg's office, the desk phone began ringing over and over. A server ran in and said the POS system wouldn't let anyone log in. Greg snapped around, his smile still stuck on his face but no longer matching his eyes. At the bar, 2 guests who didn't understand what was happening stopped lifting their glasses. A man in a gray suit asked the hostess why his bill wouldn't print. The hostess looked at the screen, then toward the kitchen where Greg usually appeared to handle every problem with a fake smile. This time, Greg didn't step out. He stood in the passageway, phone in his hand, unable to press a number. Nathan listened to the office phone ring for the 4th time. He knew the call would be from Sterling Operations Center, then National HR, and then Legal. That process had been designed to protect the government from major emergencies. Tonight, it was being used to protect the very people the restaurant had forgotten to protect. Elena was still kneeling beside Toby, but her hands weren't shaking the way they had been before. She picked up the last few coins, placed them in her wallet, and slowly zipped it shut. Nathan didn't turn toward her. He knew that if he looked, he would see the question he didn't yet deserve to answer. Nathan stood still in the middle of the kitchen, in front of Elena and Toby. He didn't hit Greg, didn't curse, didn't need to introduce himself. In a few minutes, the entire restaurant would do that for him. And for the first time that night, Greg Marlowe was no longer sure he was the most powerful man in the room. 5 minutes after Nathan's call, the Oak no longer operated like a fine dining restaurant. The payment terminals at the host stand were still locked. The reservation screen had switched into administrator mode. A kitchen, the chef stood beside a pan of sauce cooling on the stove, a towel still in his hand. Out in the dining room, guests were beginning to realize this wasn't a normal system outage. A few turned toward the glass entrance as 3 black SUVs pulled up to the curb, their headlights cutting through the rain on the window. Greg Marlowe stepped out of the kitchen before anyone else. He tugged his suit collar into place, smoothed his hair with his palm, and for 2 seconds tried to put his professional manager face back on. He had survived for years by changing his voice at the right moment. With employees, he used a threatening voice. With wealthy guests, he used a service voice. With superiors, he used a loyal voice. 2 women and 1 man entered first. The woman in the center was Marcia Bell, Sterling Hospitality's National Director of Human Resources. Nathan had appointed her because she didn't smile when she read labor violation reports. To her right was Daniel Price, head of legal, holding a tablet and a thin folder. Behind them were 2 corporate security officers in black suits, who only closed the door gently so the entire room could hear the glass latch click shut. Greg rushed forward to greet them. He bent just enough, called Marcia by name in a fake familiar tone, and explained that the restaurant was dealing with a minor issue involving a probationary employee and a server who had violated policy. He tried to place himself in the role of the person controlling the situation. A mouth moved quickly, one hand pointing toward the kitchen, where Elena was holding Toby close beside the storage boxes, and Nate Miller stood near the dish station in a t-shirt wet with soapy water. Marcia didn't stop, neither did Daniel. They walked straight past Greg as if he were a chair left in the wrong place. That was the first moment he understood he had mistaken his role in the scene. His smile remained on his mouth, but his eyes followed the two senior executives heading into the kitchen. Nathan stood beside the sink, his hands red from chemicals, the apron already removed and lying on the box. He didn't move when Marcia and Daniel stopped in front of him. The whole kitchen was watching. The same people who had called him Nate, asked him to wash trays, told him to carry trash, now watched the head of legal lower his head to him. Daniel spoke quietly, but clearly enough to be heard. "Mr. Chairman, the audit file you requested is ready." Greg stepped back. His lower back hit the edge of the mobile bar cart near the kitchen door, making two clean glasses tap against each other. The small sound of glass against glass was sharp in the room. A young server covered her mouth with her hand. The sous chef looked down at Nathan's slip-resistant shoes, then up at his face, as if his brain needed to stitch together two images that couldn't exist at the same time: the new dishwasher and the chairman of Sterling Hospitality. Nathan didn't change shirts, didn't wash his hands, didn't ask anyone to call him by his last name. He only stepped out of the kitchen, past Greg, and moved to the space between the dining room and the bar, where employees, guests, and management could all hear him. Elena stood a few steps behind, one arm around Toby, the other holding the cloth bag she had gathered in a hurry but hadn't fully zipped. Toby still covered one ear, his other hand gripping his mother's shirt. Nathan looked around the restaurant. He saw the polished oak tables, the crystal wine glasses, the artwork chosen by the design team, all the things that had once made him proud of the brand standard. Tonight, they couldn't cover the smell of old oil in the kitchen, couldn't cover the cut-tip envelopes, and couldn't cover the child still shaking because a grown man had dragged him out of a storage room. Marcia opened the tablet. Daniel placed the file on the bar. Corporate justice, if it has teeth, usually begins with numbers. Nathan picked up the first page and looked at Greg. Over the past 3 months, the Oaks electronic tip pool had been held back by an average of 30% under the name operational support. The total amount not properly distributed was $17,486. Greg's approval signature appeared on every weekly summary. Then came deductions for broken glasses, dirty towels, employee meals, uniforms, and training costs taken from employees at rates not listed in company policy. Elena Morales alone had been charged $123 over 6 months, including the wine glass from Wednesday night, billed at 5 times its actual unit cost. Greg opened his mouth, but Daniel placed another page in front of him. Food invoices appeared with delivery dates, expiration dates, receiving signatures, and relabeling notes. 3 batches of chicken, 2 crates of vegetables, and 1 shipment of cream sauce had been past date and still moved into service. Photos from the walk-in, timestamps from internal cameras, and inventory scan codes were printed beside one another. Greg had believed a few strips of white tape were enough to hide the dates. He hadn't known Sterling's cold chain system still stored every scan. Nathan read through each section in an even voice. He didn't call Greg a thief. He let the numbers do that. He didn't call Greg cruel. He let the short kitchen camera audio, which Daniel played briefly, release Greg's words calling Toby a filthy little germ. The sound from the tablet wasn't loud, but it was enough to make a few guests in the dining room set down their knives and forks. Elena pulled Toby closer. Nathan stopped the audio immediately, not letting the child hear it a second time. Greg tried to cling to procedure. He said every tip hold supported operations. Every employee knew about it. The food hadn't harmed any customers, and Elena had violated policy by bringing a child into an employee area. He spoke fast, one sentence pushing into the next, like a man trying to build a wall out of paper, while rain had already soaked through every layer. That was when Marcia finally spoke. She said the Oak had no policy allowing a branch manager to hold a percentage of tips to cover operating costs. Every wage deduction had to be disclosed, limited, and matched against labor law and company policy. Threatening to withhold Elena's entire 2 weeks of wages was a serious violation. Seizing unpaid tips was grounds to refer the matter to labor authorities. Relabeling expired food was falsification of operating records. Greg turned toward Nathan, as if speaking directly to the highest-ranking person in the room might pull the story back into territory he could control. He said he had only been protecting the Oak's standards. A fine dining restaurant couldn't turn into a daycare. It couldn't let employees break rules. It couldn't let a server drag her personal life into an operations area. He called himself the one who maintained discipline. Lathan said Greg wasn't simply being fired. His employment was being terminated for cause, effective immediately. Sterling Hospitality would file a civil claim to recover misappropriated company funds, refer the file to the proper authorities for embezzlement, falsification of records, tip wage violations, and possible Fair Labor Standards Act violations. The wages and tips withheld from all employees would be advanced back within 24 hours, then reconciled after the audit. Somewhere in the dining room, a breath escaped, then was swallowed back down. The staff didn't clap. They were still trying to calculate whether this was real, whether they would still have jobs tomorrow, whether the man who had washed dishes beside them was looking at them as witnesses or as people who needed protection. Nathan looked at the servers, kitchen staff, bar staff, and dishwashers. He said plainly that no one working that night would be disciplined for speaking to legal. Every statement would be protected under the anti-retaliation policy. Only after that sentence was spoken did the sous chef breathe out. A server pressed her tip envelope against her chest, eyes red but not crying. The young bartender bent down to pick up the name tag that had fallen from his pocket, his hand shaking so badly it took him 2 trees to clip it back on. The front door opened again. 2 Dallas police officers walked in with a Sterling corporate security investigator. No weapons were drawn. Daniel had sent the preliminary file on the way to the Oak, and internal security had confirmed that Greg had tried to delete part of a tip report after the system locked down. That was enough for the police to ask him to come with them for questioning over allegations of misappropriation and falsifying company records. Greg couldn't perform anymore. He looked at Nathan, then at Marcia, then at the employees he was used to seeing with their heads down. He said everyone was misunderstanding and that he would call his lawyer. One officer asked him to place his hands behind his back. When the cuffs locked, the sound of metal was smaller than every voice Greg had ever used to scare people, but it held the whole room in a different kind of stillness. Elena didn't look at that scene for long. She was rubbing Toby's back, counting slowly with his breathing. To her, Greg in handcuffs didn't automatically repair what had happened 3 hours earlier. Tips could be returned, a job could be restored, but the memory of her bag being thrown onto the floor in front of her son didn't vanish, just because a bad man was being taken away. As Greg was led through the dining room, a regular customer he had once flattered lowered his eyes to his phone to avoid looking at him. Greg passed the table where the glass had broken, and Elena had been charged for it. The clean piece of stemware on the table looked more innocent than the number Greg had written into his notebook. Nathan watched him until the glass door closed. Then he turned toward Elena. He bent down and picked up her cloth bag. An old lipstick was still under the leg of a chair. He picked that up too, wiped the dust off with a napkin and placed it inside. That gesture changed the rhythm of the room. It wasn't a chairman bestowing mercy on an employee. It was a man bending down to pick up what another man had thrown away to humiliate a mother. Nathan zipped the bag closed and offered it to her with both hands. Elena accepted it, but her hands were stiff. Toby looked at Nathan over his mother's shoulder. The boy was exhausted, his eyes swollen from crying, but he still held the green dinosaur. Nathan lowered himself to the child's level and asked softly if he wanted to be carried out of this loud place. Elena hesitated. Toby didn't like strangers touching him, but he looked at Nathan, looked at the wet t-shirt and the red hands, then gave one tiny nod. Nathan lifted Toby carefully, not holding him too tight. The boy stayed rigid for a few seconds, then rested his forehead against Nathan's shoulder, worn out. Nathan stood and turned toward Elena. In that moment, the image of the chairman carrying a waitress's son through the middle of the restaurant didn't make Nathan look more powerful. It made him look like a father who had remembered what mattered. I said, "My kids really did love your strawberry tart. That wasn't a perfect thank you." It was the first true piece of himself Nathan had offered after 2 weeks of lying. Elena looked at him. In her eyes came a late understanding. That first night, the story about children who rarely got roasted chicken wasn't completely false, but everything around it had been staged. The old shirt, the name Nate, the dishwasher job, the poverty she thought she was sharing. He had stood beside her at the bottom, but there had always been a safety rope made of money and power that she never had. Nathan handed Toby back when he saw her arms open. Elena held her son and stepped back once. Not far, but enough for the distance between them to become visible. Marcia started to step forward to speak about reinstatement, back pay, and mental health support for employees. Elena didn't look at her. She looked at Nathan. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her voice lowered, carrying exhaustion and a wound that was starting to show. She said she was grateful Greg had been stopped, but she didn't know which man she was supposed to thank. Nate, who had eaten half her sandwich in the storage room, or Nathan Sterling, who had let her believe he had nothing but a child who needed dinner. Nathan opened his mouth, then stopped. He had never lacked words in a boardroom, but in front of Elena, every reason that had sounded right in his head suddenly felt small. He had believed he was searching for the truth, but Elena's truth was not an object he had the right to test and mark complete. Elena lifted the bag onto her shoulder and adjusted Toby's raincoat. The boy leaned into her, too exhausted to cover his ears anymore. She walked past Nathan, past Marcia, past Daniel, past the staff who were still watching. No one stopped her. At the door, she paused only to take her old coat from the employee hook. On her name tag, the word Elena was still marked with a water stain. Nathan stood in the middle of his own restaurant, for the first time in years unable to use money, power, or legal force to fix the most important thing in the room. Greg had been removed, the system had been locked down, the money would be repaid. But Elena walked out with Toby without looking back. Nathan understood too late that justice could throw a bad man out the door, but it couldn't force a woman with self-respect to stay after she had been turned into part of a rich man's test. Elena Morales left the oak in the thin rain near the end of the night, one arm around Toby, the other holding her old cloth bag tight against her hip. The boy was too exhausted to cry anymore. He only rested his forehead on his mother's shoulder, the green plastic dinosaur caught between two fingers. Behind them, the restaurant's glass doors still glowed. Legal was still moving through the building, and guests were still whispering, but Elena didn't turn back. That night she had seen Greg in handcuffs, had been promised her wages would be returned, and had watched the dishwasher named Nate turn into Nathan Sterling. But none of that made her steps feel lighter. Elena's apartment was on the third floor of an old building 2 bus lines from the Oak. The stairwell smelled like cheap floor cleaner and damp raincoats. Toby fell asleep on her shoulder before she opened the door. Elena laid him down in bed and changed his shirt with slow movements so he wouldn't wake. Then she sat on the edge of the mattress and watched her son curl himself around the green dinosaur, one hand still close to his ear, as if his body didn't yet trust that the noise was over. She placed the cloth bag on the kitchen table. The things Greg had thrown onto the floor had been picked up, but nothing was in its proper place anymore. Wallet, bus pass, medicine box, tuition bill, Toby's photo. Elena put each item back into its pocket and wiped the dirt from the photo with a paper towel. When she reached the oak name tag, she stopped. The word Elena was still clear, but the pin on the back was bent. She placed it in the drawer, not because she missed the job, but because those long shifts and those shoes worn down at the heels didn't deserve to be thrown away that night. The next morning, Elena woke up at 6, even though she didn't have a shift. Poor people's routines don't disappear just because they've been fired. She made oatmeal for Toby, checked his therapy schedule, then opened her phone to look for jobs near the bus route. Toby sat at the table, sorting crayons in the order blue, yellow, and red. He didn't ask about Greg or why his mother wasn't wearing her uniform. He only pushed his dinosaur next to the oatmeal bowl, as if it needed breakfast too. Elena didn't regret walking out of the oak. She needed money, needed work, and needed Toby's tuition. But she also needed her son to see that his mother wouldn't stay in a place where people called him a filthy name. Pride doesn't pay bills, she had told Nate. But that morning she understood something harder. If you lose your self-respect, paid bills still aren't enough to keep a person standing straight. Near 9, someone knocked on the door. 3 slow knocks, then a pause. Elena looked through the peephole. Nathan Sterling stood in the hallway with no bodyguards, no lawyers, and no PR team. He wore a gray sweater, his left hand holding a blonde 5-year-old girl, his right hand resting gently on the shoulder of an 8-year-old boy. In the boy's hands was a small paper box tied with string, the same kind of box the Oak used for strawberry tarts. Elena opened the door but didn't step back right away. Nathan saw that and didn't try to come in. He stood outside the threshold like a man who understood he hadn't been invited in yet. Oliver, the older boy, lifted the box with both hands, so serious that Elena almost forgot to be angry. Sophie hid behind her father's leg, curious as eyes on Toby, who stood behind the kitchen table. Nathan said he had come to opine himself first. That made Elena go still. After years of serving tables, she had heard plenty of apologies that started with "but." "I'm sorry, but I was under pressure. I'm sorry, but you misunderstood. I'm sorry, but I had a reason." Nathan didn't use that word. Elena let the three of them in because the hallway was cold and because Toby had already seen the box. The small apartment left Nathan's wealth with nowhere to hide. An old kitchen table, two mismatched chairs, a slightly leaning bookshelf, a refrigerator covered with therapy schedules and bills. Nathan saw it all, but this time he wasn't observing like he was inspecting something. He placed his keys and phone face down on the table, as if trying to prove he hadn't brought the whole empire into her home. Oliver placed the box on the table. Inside were 4 small strawberry tarts, not the fancy kind served at events, but a simple version. The boy said his father told him they needed to bring cake today to return the kindness. Nathan placed a hand on his son's shoulder and gently corrected him. Kindness couldn't be paid back with cake, he said, but remembering it correctly was a place to start. Elena stood beside the sink, both arms crossed in front of her stomach. Toby slowly moved toward the box, looking at the strawberries, then at Oliver. Children didn't need adult biographies to recognize something sweet. Sophie pulled a small stuffed animal from her coat pocket and placed it on the table near Toby, but not too close. Toby looked at the toy, then looked back at the cake. The moment softened the air, but it didn't erase what Nathan still needed to say. He didn't sit until Elena pointed to a chair. When he did, he turned the old wedding band once, then stopped. He told her only a little, but enough. His wife had died 4 years ago, leaving him with 2 children and a house with too many empty rooms. After that, the people who entered his life often saw the Sterling name before they saw Oliver and Sophie. He started pretending to be poor because he was afraid of being loved for money, afraid his children would have to welcome someone who only wanted the seat of Mrs. Sterling. Nathan said what he should have said from the beginning. His fear that other people would use him for his wealth did not give him the right to make Elena part of a test. He had entered her realm of exhaustion under a false identity. He had accepted half her sandwich and listened to her talk about Toby standing beside her in the storage room while still holding a safety rope she didn't have. He said he had pretended to be poor because he was afraid people only loved his assets, but lying to her had been just as cruel as the gold diggers he feared. The kitchen stayed quiet for a few seconds. The refrigerator clicked on, its low hum filling the gap. Elena looked down at the table, where the box of tarts sat open, and Toby had taken a seat beside Oliver, touching the cream with a plastic fork. She didn't forgive him right away. A good apology doesn't force the listener to hurry up and be generous. Nathan took a contract from a thin folder and placed it on the table, but didn't push it toward her like a gift. He said this wasn't a check, wasn't private compensation, and wasn't a way to buy her silence. Sterling Hospitality was creating an independent employee welfare fund after what had happened at the Oak. The fund would monitor working conditions, support healthcare needs for employees' children, and handle complaints about tips, wages, and abusive management. He wanted Elena to become the fund's director. Elena gave a very quiet laugh, with no joy in it. She asked if he really thought a waitress and mother who had just been fired the night before could walk into a corporation and run a fund. Nathan didn't answer with flattery. He said she had already been doing that work for years without a title, seeing who had been left behind, knowing what employee meals really looked like, knowing one broken glass penalty could wreck tuition, knowing workers needed fair shifts, decent managers, and a phone number someone actually answered. He said she would have finance, legal, HR, and professional advisors behind her. She wouldn't be placed in an office as a symbol. She would have the authority to inspect branches, recommend manager suspensions, approve emergency support funds, and report directly to the new welfare board. The salary was written clearly. Toby's insurance was included in the family package. The contract had a clause allowing her to have an independent attorney review it before signing, paid for by Sterling. That last detail made Elena look at him longer. People who wanted to buy someone off usually wanted a fast signature. She didn't accept that day. She took the contract, folded it, and said she needed time to think and needed someone who understood the law to read it. Nathan nodded. Before leaving, Sophie turned back and gave Toby a light hug. Toby stood stiff for a few seconds, then patted her back twice. Oliver left the box with 2 tarts on the table. Nathan didn't ask for another chance. He only thanked her for letting his children meet the person who had bought them their first tart without needing to know who they were. 3 weeks later, Elena signed the contract. Not because Nathan was rich, and not because 1 box of strawberry tarts had softened her heart. She signed after an attorney from a local labor organization read every page, underlined the real powers in the agreement, and told her the contract gave her more authority than most welfare directors in the service industry. On her first day at Sterling headquarters, Elena wore an old blazer borrowed from a neighbor. Her shoes were still worn at the heels, but her new employee badge carried her real name and her real title. The months that followed weren't a fairy tale. Elena learned how to read budgets, how to sit in meetings with people who use complicated words to hide simple decisions, and how not to let anyone turn her into a harmless, inspirational story. She visited branches without notice, ate employee meals, stood in dish rooms, and asked how tips were divided. When a regional manager said a few withheld amounts were standard in the market, Elena placed 3 pay stubs on the table and asked if he wanted to say that in front of the people they belonged to. The welfare fund started small, but it went where it mattered. A line cook in Houston received help paying for his son's diabetes medication. A housekeeper in Phoenix received an emergency advance after her husband lost his job. A group of servers in Atlanta had wrongly withheld tips returned. Elena didn't call it a miracle. She called it money that should never have been taken in the first place. Greg's case lasted longer than the media liked. The investigation found enough records to pursue charges for embezzlement, falsifying records, and systematic labor violations. A year later, Greg was serving time. The Oak replaced its entire management team, moved to a transparent tip-sharing model, opened a direct complaint line, and hung a plain notice in the employee break room. If your paycheck is wrong, call this number. Elena taped up the first notice herself. As for Nathan and Elena, they didn't become a family because of one apology. He kept showing up on time for welfare fund meetings and stopped interfering with her decisions. She kept the distance she needed, because trust isn't something a rich man can demand overnight. But Oliver and Sophie sometimes appeared at events for employees' children. Toby learned to sit beside Oliver in the quiet corner, drawing dinosaurs on paper. Sophie always saved the strawberry pieces for Toby if he wanted them, but she learned from Elena that she had to ask first. 1 year after the night at the Oak, dinner happened in Nathan's kitchen, not the formal dining room. Elena chose that. She didn't want a long table, silverdals, or a private chef. She wanted a meal where 5 people could serve themselves more potatoes. Nathan cooked roasted chicken from a recipe online and burned the skin a little. Oliver said it was crispy. Sophie said it was a little black but still good with sauce. Toby only ate potatoes and bread, but he sat still for 20 full minutes, a victory Elena saw more clearly than anyone else. After dinner, the 3 children shared the last strawberry tart. Nathan stood by the sink, sleeves rolled up, washing dishes. Elena wept table. No fake apron, no cruel manager, no VIP guests whispering. Only the sound of children arguing over markers in the next room, and the smell of roasted chicken still lingering in the kitchen. Nathan looked at Elena and didn't ask if this was a family yet. He had learned that the truest things don't need to be named too early. Elena set the cloth down and looked at the 3 children laughing because Toby had just drawn a dinosaur wearing a chef's hat. She was no longer the waitress whose bag had been thrown onto the floor by a manager. She also wasn't the prize at the end of a billionaire's redemption arc. She was the woman who had held onto her dignity when holding onto it could have cost her everything, and that dignity had brought her to this kitchen, where no one had to pretend to be anyone else to stay. When I think about this story, I keep coming back to the strawberry tart. Not the Maybach in the alley, not the legal team walking into the Oak, not the moment Greg was put in cuffs in front of the staff. Those scenes show us justice, but that small tart is what helps us understand the person. Elena didn't buy that tart because she had extra money. She bought it with her last tip, during a shift when Greg was ready to deduct her pay for any tiny mistake. The half sandwich she shared with Nate was the same. It wasn't worth much on a bill, but it weighed far more than Nathan's billions because it was given when she almost had nothing. Kindness from abundance is valuable, but kindness when you're struggling carries a different weight. Nathan had fallen into the trap of power and prejudice. He believed people would judge him by his wealth, so he decided to judge them by how they reacted to fake poverty. It sounded fair, but in truth, it was still a game where the person with power wrote the rules. He could take off the poor man's shirt at any moment. Elena couldn't. That difference was the wound that made her walk out of the oak. She didn't reject justice. She rejected having her dignity turned into a rich man's test. I think that's the most honorable thing about Elena. She didn't let the arrival of money make her forget that she had been deceived. She knew Nathan had saved her from Greg, but she also knew that being saved didn't require her to swallow every hurt. Her self-respect wasn't exempt against love. It protected love from becoming a debt. A woman like Elena could be poor, tired, and afraid of her son's tuition bill, but she didn't let anyone buy the right to define her value. And Nathan only truly grew up when he understood that. He didn't come back with a blank check. He didn't arrive with lawyers, bodyguards, or shiny promises. He came with his 2 children, a small box of cake, and an apology that didn't demand Elena forgive him right away. Sincerity wasn't in how much he could give her. It was in the fact that he finally dared to say, "I was wrong, and my mistake hurt you." Maybe that's what many of us need to hear. Money can fix systems, repay wages, hire lawyers, open funds, and punish bad people. But money can't replace sincerity. It can't force trust to return, and it can't make a self-respecting forget they were once placed under a microscope. To heal, a person has to step down from power and stand like an ordinary human being. Comment sincerity below if you think it's the most precious treasure. Remember to like and subscribe to Single Mom Billionaire Story so that we can continue to walk together through such healing stories. Now it's late. Shut your eyes and take a nap. It will be warmer tomorrow.